For weeks, investigators, journalists, and the people who love Nancy have been staring at that porch, trying to understand what it means, trying to read something, anything, in what is essentially almost nothing. Almost. Because here is what most people covering this case don't know. Here is what hasn't been explained, not properly, not fully, in any of the press conferences or the news segments or the social media threads where thousands of people have been piecing this together on their own. Those 2 drops of blood are not nothing. They are not a dead end. They are not evidence so sparse it tells us nothing useful. Those 2 drops of blood tell a complete story. They describe a specific sequence of events. They reveal the condition Nancy was in at the moment they were produced. They tell us what the person who took her did to get her out of that house. And they carry within them the behavioral fingerprint of an offender whose mistakes he almost certainly doesn't know he made, are going to get him caught. The man who read that story is Jim Clementi, retired FBI special agent, former behavioral profiler. A man who has spent his entire career learning to make physical evidence say things that witnesses can't, that suspects won't, that the dead no longer can. He went through the footage of that porch frame by frame. He isolated images. He studied the shape, the size, the pattern, and the internal structure of those drops. And what he found changes the way this entire case has to be understood. So let's go through it. All of it. Because you deserve more than the surface version of this story. The first thing you need to understand is that blood does not behave the same way in every situation. It behaves according to physics. According to the force that produced it, the height it fell from, the angle at which it hit the surface, and the substance it carries inside it. Forensic investigators categorize blood spatter into 3 broad types: low velocity, medium velocity, high velocity. High velocity spatter is what you see at a gunshot scene. The impact is so sudden and so forceful that the blood is essentially atomized, reduced to a fine, almost misty spray of microscopic droplets. You cannot confuse it with anything else. It is distinctive and it is unmistakable. Low velocity spatter is what you see when blood simply drips. A wound held above a surface, blood falling straight down under its own weight. The drops are large, rounded, with clean edges. Medium velocity is different. Medium velocity spatter is produced by force, not a bullet but impact, a blow to the face, and it is also produced by something else, by coughing, by blood that has been drawn into the lungs with breath, mixed with air, and then expelled outward with the muscular force of a cough. What Jim Clementi found on Nancy Guthrie's porch was medium velocity spatter. And the moment he identified it as medium velocity, the entire picture of what happened on that porch shifted. Because medium velocity spatter produced by coughing tells you 3 things simultaneously. It tells you the blood came from inside the body, not from a surface wound. It tells you it was expelled through the mouth with significant force. And it tells you that the person who produced it was not standing upright when it happened. Here is why that last point matters. The drops landed on the porch surface, not on a wall. Not at an angle consistent with someone standing or walking. On the ground directly below. Which means the face that produced them was pointing almost straight down. Within roughly 1 foot of the surface. Which means Nancy Guthrie, at the moment those drops landed, was not on her feet. She was on her knees. Or hunched completely forward. Or some combination of the 2. Face toward the ground. Coughing blood onto the concrete of her own front porch. Let that image form completely before we move on. Because it is important. It is the physical record of a specific moment in a specific night, frozen in place, waiting for someone trained to read it. Now, the drops were not all the same. Some of them were solid. Normal drops of blood, the size and shape consistent with medium velocity spatter from a cough. But several of them were not solid. Several of them were rings. A ring in blood spatter is not a curiosity. It is a specific, identifiable, meaningful phenomenon. It occurs when the drop of blood that lands on a surface contains an air bubble. When the drop hits the surface and the bubble bursts, the blood spreads in a ring, a hollow circle, an outline where a filled drop should have been. Blood only contains air bubbles in one circumstance. When it has been aspirated. When it has been pulled down into the lungs along with breath and then mixed with the air already there. When it has been absorbed into the respiratory system before being expelled. The ring-shaped drops on Nancy Guthrie's porch are not just blood. They are blood that passed through her lungs. Blood that mixed with her breath. Blood that she coughed up from inside her body. This is not a surface wound. This is not a cut lip or a scraped hand. This is internal bleeding significant enough that it produced aspiration. Significant enough that Nancy's body was pulling blood into her airways and her lungs were expelling it. Someone hit Nancy Guthrie hard enough to cause internal bleeding. Hard enough that the blood reached her lungs. Hard enough that she went down, face toward the ground, knees on the concrete, and coughed that blood onto the surface below her. An 84-year-old woman. But there was a third element in the blood evidence that Jim identified. And this one tells you what happened next. There was a smear. Smear patterns and spatter patterns are different things entirely. Spatter is what happens at the moment of impact. Blood hitting a surface as it falls or is expelled. It is a record of motion through the air. A smear is what happens after. It is evidence of contact with blood that has already landed. A hand pressing into it. A shoe stepping through it. A body part dragging across it. Something disturbing the shape the blood had already taken. There was a smear in the pattern on Nancy's porch. And Jim's interpretation of that smear is this. Someone made physical contact with the blood after it was deposited. Most likely a shoe. Most likely the shoe of the person who was already there. And then the blood trail stops. There is no more blood beyond the porch. No drops leading down the walkway. No trail to the street. No drips marking the path to wherever a vehicle was parked. The blood simply ends. Right there. Right where the smear is. Which means, Jim argues that at the point where the blood stops, Nancy was no longer positioned to produce it. She was lifted. Picked up off the ground. Carried. Her face no longer inches from the surface. Her wounds no longer positioned to drip downward onto anything below her. She was being taken to a vehicle. Off the ground. Face up. And the person carrying her had already stepped through the blood she had coughed onto the concrete. 2 drops. Rings in the blood. A smear. The trail stops. A complete story. A specific sequence. A record of what happened on that porch between the moment Nancy was hit and the moment she was carried away. Now here is the part that changes everything else about how this case has to be understood. If you were taking someone for money, if ransom was the reason you entered that house and took that woman, you would not want to hurt her. A living hostage is your entire leverage. She is the thing you hold over a family while the negotiation happens. She is what they are paying for. She has to be alive and she has to be demonstrably alive. Proof of life is the currency of every ransom operation. You would want her compliant or at minimum controlled. You would want her usable. But the blood on that porch says something happened that was not part of any clean ransom plan. The blood says Nancy was hit hard enough to go down. Hard enough to cough blood from her lungs. Hard enough that moving her required carrying her rather than walking her to the vehicle. So what happened? Jim's answer is the answer that should have been the headline of every story covering this case. She fought back. At some point between her bedroom and that front porch, at some moment in that sequence of being taken from her bed, moved through her own house in the dark and brought to the front door, Nancy Guthrie decided she was not going. She refused. She resisted. She did exactly what every personal safety expert in the world will tell you to do if someone tries to remove you from your location. She made it as hard as possible. She fought. An 84-year-old woman in the middle of the night, against someone younger and bigger and already inside her home, who had a plan and a vehicle waiting and had already decided he was walking out of that house with her. She fought. And the response was immediate and overwhelming. Blitz force. The kind of force designed not to kill but to end resistance. To put her on the ground. To remove her ability to continue fighting and make her manageable. The blood on the porch is the physical record of that moment. Of the last point where Nancy made this hard. Of the price she paid for refusing to go quietly. And of the fact that even then, even down on her knees, coughing blood onto her own front porch in the dark, she had forced this person to reveal something about themselves that they could not take back. They showed who they were. Right there. On that concrete. Jim Clementi raised this point without being asked, and it is worth sitting with. He said, "What does it tell you about a person that they would do this to an 84-year-old woman? Not the abduction. The violence. The willingness to hit someone that old, that small, with enough force to produce what we see in that spatter pattern. Most people, even people who are capable of doing terrible things, have some internal threshold that an elderly woman triggers. Some residual hesitation. Some instinct that pulls them back from that specific act even when they've crossed every other line. This person did not have that hesitation. Jim's interpretation. It tells you the goal mattered more than the humanity of the person between them and it. That this individual had already made the calculation, before they ever stepped through Nancy's door, before they ever stood over her bed, that if she resisted, they would do whatever was required to override that resistance. This was not a moment of lost control. It was not rage. It was something colder. A predetermined decision. A line already crossed before the crime began. That is premeditation in its most precise form. Not just planning the abduction. planning the response to resistance, deciding in advance that an 84-year-old woman's refusal to cooperate would be met with force sufficient to end it. And premeditated offenders, Jim says, leave a different kind of evidence trail than impulsive ones. They plan. Planning requires movement, observation, time, resources. It requires being near the target location before the crime. It creates patterns. And patterns, in the world of cell phone location data and license plate readers and doorbell cameras that people forget are running, create records. Every time this person was near Nancy Guthrie's property before that night, and Jim is certain they were there more than once, there was the possibility of a camera, a neighbor, a timestamp, a record of a vehicle that shouldn't have been there, idling at the wrong hour, driving past the same house one too many times. They don't know what they left, but something was left. Jim is sure of it. There were ransom notes. 2 of them sent to local television stations in Arizona. Not to the Guthrie family directly. Not to law enforcement. To media outlets. Savannah Guthrie has said she believes at least 2 of the notes are genuine. And when investigators traced the Bitcoin wallet address attached to one of those notes, they found something significant. A transaction was made into that account on February 10th. A small deposit, almost certainly from the FBI acting on behalf of the family, designed as a signal. Attached to that transaction was a message. * We are ready to talk. Contact us. * There was no response. No counter demand. No proof of life request. No negotiation. The account went silent and stayed silent. A family opened a door and said, "We are here, we are listening, we want to bring her home." And the person on the other side said nothing. Jim Clementi's reading of that silence is the hardest thing in this entire case to absorb. He believes that by February 10th, Nancy was already gone. That whoever sent those ransom notes had, by the time the family signaled their willingness to negotiate, nothing left to negotiate with. That the silence was not strategy. It was not a tactical decision to hold back and increase pressure. It was the silence of someone who no longer had anything to offer. Because if your motive is money, and the family just told you they are ready to talk, you respond. You have every reason to respond. The only reason you don't, the only explanation for that silence, is that the thing you were selling no longer exists. But Jim takes seriously the possibility that money was never the only motive, or even the primary one. Think about what those ransom notes represent as a behavioral choice. Not their content, their target. They were sent to television stations, to media outlets. In a case involving the mother of one of the most visible journalists in America, a professional kidnapper does not do that. A professional understands that media involvement is the worst possible outcome for a ransom operation. The moment a story breaks publicly, law enforcement mobilizes at a different scale. The clock compresses. Every advantage the kidnapper had, silence, time, the family's desperation to keep things quiet, evaporates immediately. A professional keeps the circle so small it barely exists. No press. No police until absolutely necessary. Secrecy is the leverage. This person sent notes to television stations. Jim's interpretation: he wanted the story told. He wanted to watch it. He wanted to see Savannah Guthrie on camera, distressed, pleading, focused entirely on whoever had taken her mother. He wanted to be the reason for all of it. That is not a kidnapping motivation. That is a fixation motivation. A compulsion to be seen, to be felt, to force attention from someone who had, in the fantasy this person had constructed, been ignoring them. Jim described this possibility carefully. A stalking motive. Not necessarily toward Nancy herself, but toward Savannah. Someone who had built up a mental world in which Savannah Guthrie owed them something, attention, recognition, acknowledgement, and who had grown increasingly angry at not receiving it. Someone for whom this act was, in a deeply disturbed way, a form of communication. A way of saying, "You will look at me now." And it worked. Savannah made direct, public pleas to whoever had her mother. She addressed them on camera. She looked into the lens and spoke to them personally. For someone with a fixation-based motive, that, watching those pleas, feeling that attention, may have accomplished exactly what they wanted, independent of whether the ransom was ever paid. The two motives are not mutually exclusive. Money and fixation. Ransom and compulsion. Both can exist in the same person, driving the same act from different psychological directions. What Jim is saying is that the behavior, the choice to send notes to media rather than directly to the family, the Bitcoin account that went silent when contact was made, suggests this person was not operating from a clean, rational financial calculation. There was something messier underneath it. Something that personal safety experts and behavioral profilers recognize as far more dangerous than simple greed. If you're following this case and you want to understand who did this, not as a category, not as a criminal type, but as a specific individual with specific behaviors and specific mistakes, Jim Clementi's profile is where to start. This person is almost certainly a man. The figure captured on surveillance footage in the vicinity of the property at the relevant time is male. Jim sees no evidence suggesting otherwise. This person is not a professional criminal. He is not someone who has done this before at this level, thought through the forensic implications, and made careful decisions based on that experience. The evidence of his inexperience is specific and detailed. The backpack he carried was identifiable. The kind sold at Walmart with bright reflective straps. In a surveillance context where you want to be as nondescript as possible, you carry something generic and dark. You do not carry something that reflects light and can be identified by brand and retailer. He didn't know that. Or he knew it vaguely and chose comfort and convenience over operational security. The face covering he chose allowed him to breathe comfortably. It also allowed him to shed hair, to lose skin cells, to distribute his DNA at every location he moved through. A surgical mask, the kind that costs almost nothing and is available everywhere, would have prevented most of that. He chose the wrong mask. Not because he didn't know masks existed, but because he didn't understand what the mask was actually supposed to prevent. These are not the mistakes of someone who studied what they were doing. These are the mistakes of someone who watched enough true crime content to know they needed a mask and a backpack and a plan, but not enough to understand the forensic specifics of why each of those choices matters. He thought he was being sophisticated. He was not. But here is the detail that Jim keeps returning to, because it is the one that matters most for the investigation going forward. This person knew things about Nancy Guthrie's home and life that you cannot know from public information. He knew she lived alone. He knew the layout well enough to enter without forced entry. He knew which door to use. He knew her routines, her schedule, her patterns well enough to choose a specific night and a specific hour. That knowledge comes from proximity. From time spent in or around that household in a context that seemed entirely innocent at the time. A contractor who did work on the house. Someone who serviced the pool or the yard. A driver. A delivery person. Someone who sat in that living room or stood in that driveway in a role that gave them access, not to the house itself, but to the information that made the house exploitable. Jim is not guessing. He is reading the behavioral signature of the crime. And the signature says, this person had access. Before that night, they were already inside the perimeter of Nancy Guthrie's life. And whoever hired them or recommended them or let them through the gate has no idea. Now, let's talk about what this person is doing right now. Because one of the most valuable things a behavioral profiler does is not reconstruct what happened. It is predict what the suspect is doing in the aftermath. The adjustments they make. The behavior they can't suppress. The mistakes they continue to make in the days and weeks after the crime. And why those ongoing mistakes are, in many cases, exactly what ultimately produces an arrest. Jim is confident on every point of this. This person is watching the coverage. All of it. Every press conference. Every news segment. Every social media discussion connected to this case. He knows what has been said publicly. He is monitoring the investigation from the outside, trying to assess what investigators know and what they don't, trying to gauge how close they are. And he is doing it obsessively because the case is, in a real sense, about him, and some deep part of him cannot look away from that. He has changed his appearance. His hair most likely. Possibly a beard or the absence of one. He has changed something about how he looks because he knows there was surveillance footage and he knows his face may be on it, and changing your appearance is the one response to that situation that feels actionable. He has almost certainly changed or removed his vehicle. If a car was connected to the crime scene, parked on a nearby street, caught on a camera he didn't know was there, that car is either gone or significantly different now. Sold, traded, repainted, fitted with new plates. Felt like the smart move. It may also be the move that draws attention, because a sudden, unexplained vehicle change in the weeks after a major local crime is the kind of behavioral flag that investigators are specifically trained to notice. He has increased the distance between himself and the crime scene. He may have left the area entirely. A family emergency. A job opportunity. A sudden need to visit relatives in another state. Whatever story he used, it created space and space felt like safety. But here is what Jim knows from decades of studying this specific type of offender. Paranoid people do not become invisible. They become more visible in the process of trying to disappear. They overcorrect. They change too many things too quickly. They ask careful questions of people around them, questions about how the investigation is going, what the police are saying, whether anyone has heard anything, in ways that aren't quite careful enough. They draw attention to themselves by the intensity of their effort not to be noticed. And the mistakes they made before and during the crime do not go away simply because time is passing. Every one of those mistakes is a piece of evidence being processed somewhere. The backpack with the identifiable straps. The wrong mask. The biological material shed at the scene and possibly along the route. The digital footprint created by the phone they were carrying, recording their location at every tower they passed. Jim believes this person will be caught. He said it plainly without qualification. The evidence exists. The path forward exists. And forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 4 decades, the same technology that cracked cold cases from the 1950s using DNA preserved in glass jars, has now become precise enough that a single biological trace, properly preserved, can be run through ancestry databases, matched to distant relatives, and eventually walked back to a specific living person. If this person's DNA is in that house, and Jim believes it is, that process is already underway. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly in a laboratory somewhere while the news cycle moves on and the public assumes nothing is happening. And then one day, without warning, there is a name. There is one more thing Jim raised that has received almost no attention in the public coverage of this case. The back door was propped open. Not broken open. Not left carelessly ajar by someone in a hurry. Propped. Deliberately held open by something placed against it intentionally from the inside. The reflex interpretation, and Jim has heard it, is that this means there were multiple people involved. That one person propped the rear exit while another handled the abduction. That the propped door indicates coordination. He doesn't see it that way. What he sees is pre-planning. Specifically, exit planning. This person entered that house with a specific plan for what would happen if the situation went wrong. If Nancy woke up earlier than expected. If a neighbor's light came on. If something forced him to move faster than anticipated. He needed a guaranteed exit route that didn't require him to fumble with a door handle in the dark while managing a non-cooperative 84-year-old woman. So he propped the rear door before he did anything else. Before he went upstairs. Before he went near Nancy's room. He secured his escape route first. The fact that he ultimately brought Nancy out the front, because the vehicle was positioned there, because the front offered faster, more direct access to his exit route from the property, means the rear door was never used. But it was there. Ready. A contingency that reveals how his mind works. He thought through failure scenarios before the crime began. He prepared for them. He staged his environment to give himself options. That level of pre-operational thinking is not consistent with someone who acted impulsively. This was researched, planned, rehearsed at least mentally more than once. And all of that planning, all of that pre-crime movement and observation and preparation, left traces. Every time he drove past that house. Every time he was close enough to study the layout. Every time he was in the neighborhood with a purpose he would never have admitted to anyone who knew him. Those traces are what Jim is most confident about. Not the crime scene itself, but the weeks before it. The approach. The preparation. The moments when this person was doing something that looked innocent from the outside but was in fact the early stages of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. There is a dimension of this case that almost no coverage has addressed seriously. And it is the one that people closest to it are living inside every single day. What does it do to someone to not know? Not to have lost someone. Not to be grieving in the clean, devastating way that grief eventually becomes, once there is something confirmed to grieve. But to exist in the space between. Where your mother might be alive. Where she might not. Where every hour that passes is simultaneously an argument for hope and an argument against it. Where you go to work, sit behind a desk, look into a camera, and perform the version of yourself that the world needs to see, while carrying something that has no name because it does not fit inside any of the categories we have built for human suffering. That is where Savannah Guthrie has been living. Jim Clementi has spent decades working with families in exactly this position. And what he says about surviving it is not complicated. It is just hard. Talk to victim services. Get professional counseling. Understand that there is no correct way to move through what you are moving through. Some people fall completely apart and then rebuild. Some channel the weight into action, into advocacy, into public pressure, into becoming a voice so loud that the case cannot be quietly shelved. Some do all of those things in rotation depending on the day and the hour and how long it has been since they last slept through the night. And some go back to work. Not because they have moved on. Not because they are coping in any way that the word coping is supposed to mean. but because sitting still inside the uncertainty is worse. Because the alternative to showing up is falling into something they may not be able to climb back out of. Because motion, even performed, professional, camera-ready motion, is a way of insisting that the world continue, that time continue, that there is still a future on the other side of this that is worth showing up for. Savannah Guthrie went back to work. And Jim says that is not a sign of someone who has detached from what happened. It is the opposite. It is someone fighting the only way they have left to fight while the investigation does what it does, slowly, quietly, without announcements, in the background. Jim has also seen, across his career, the specific friction that can develop between families and investigators over time, especially in cases where the family member is themselves knowledgeable about the legal system, where they understand enough to know what questions should have been answered by now and haven't been, where patience runs out not from ignorance but from competence, from understanding exactly how long things are taking and exactly why that is a problem. His answer is consistent. Professional investigators absorb that frustration and keep working. The job does not change because the family is angry. The job is to find the truth and hold someone accountable for what happened. Everything else is secondary to that. And in cases where investigators have stayed the course despite family anger, despite public pressure, despite the passage of time, those are often the cases where the eventual resolution is the most complete. This case will have a resolution. Jim believes it. The evidence demands it. Here is where this case stands today. Nancy has been missing for months. The Bitcoin wallet went silent after the family's signal. The ransom notes have produced no confirmed contact from whoever sent them. No arrest has been announced. But the case is not cold. It is not closed. Law enforcement has not gone quiet in the way that cases go quiet when there is genuinely nothing left to chase. The investigative work is happening, forensic processing, behavioral analysis, digital forensics, in the background, in the way that all real investigative work happens, without announcements or press conferences, until the day it produces something definitive. Jim Clemente, after reviewing everything available, the footage, the blood evidence, the ransom notes, the behavioral profile, came away with one conclusion he stated without hesitation. This person made mistakes. Specific, identifiable, traceable mistakes. Mistakes in the planning, mistakes in the execution, mistakes in the choices made afterward. And in the era of forensic genealogy and location data and digital footprints that persist long after people believe they've disappeared, those mistakes are not forgivable. They are not erasable. They are not something you outrun by changing your appearance or leaving the state. They are the thread. And threads, pulled carefully and with enough patience, unravel everything eventually. Nancy Guthrie fought on that porch. The blood says so. The rings say so. The pattern says so. An 84-year-old woman on her knees on her own front porch in the dark, coughing blood, in the last moments before she was carried away, and she made it harder. She made herself harder to take. She forced this person to show who they were. That fight matters. Not just because it tells us something about Nancy, though it tells us everything about Nancy. It matters because the act of forcing that response, of making this person react rather than execute cleanly, is what produced the evidence on that porch. Is what required him to carry her rather than walk her. Is what may have caused him to rush, to skip a step, to leave something behind that he would have otherwise thought to remove. Her resistance may be the thing that catches him. She bought that with blood on her own front porch. And this investigation will not let that go to waste. Now I want to hear from you. Based on everything in this episode, the blood spatter analysis, Jim's full behavioral profile, the ransom note motive questions, the digital silence on February 10th, who do you think took Nancy Guthrie? Do you believe this was financial from the start, or does the behavior point to something more personal? And here is the question that stays with me. If this person is watching all the coverage, monitoring every detail of this investigation the way Jim is certain they are, what does it do to them to know that an FBI profiler has just described their mistakes this precisely? That their backpack has been identified, their mask choice analyzed, their pre-crime surveillance inferred, their post-crime behavior predicted almost step by step? Does that make them more careful? Or does the pressure make them break? Drop your answers in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.